All right, let's jump into this deep dive on electricity generation. You've sent over a really interesting mix of stuff, including the Wikipedia article on electricity generation. Seems like you're ready to go deep on this. What's the motivation here? Big presentation coming up, maybe a new project, or just one of those things you got to know more about?
Hey, probably all of the above.
Well, whatever the reason, you're in the right place. We're going to break it all down. No jargon, just the good stuff.
I'm good.
So, electricity generation. It's something we all kind of take for granted, right?
Oh, yeah.
But when you really stop and think about it, I mean, creating electrical power out of thin air like that, it's actually pretty amazing.
It really is. We flip a switch and boom, instant light, instant power.
Yeah.
But that power has to come from somewhere.
Right. Exactly. It's not just sitting there waiting for us. It has to be what produced.
Produced is a good word for it.
Yeah.
We're basically transforming other types of energy into electricity.
Kind of like magic, almost.
Uh-huh. There is a sort of magic to it.
And speaking of magic, I can't help but think about Michael Faraday. Didn't he pretty much unlock the secret to electricity generation back in the 1800s?
You're thinking the 1820s and 30s, but yeah, Faraday was a genius. His experiments with magnets and wires were revolutionary. He figured out that if you move a wire loop between magnets, you create an electrical current.
Wait, so, are you saying those gigantic generators we see in power plants, are they basically just like a supersized version of Faraday's experiment?
Essentially, yeah. It all goes back to that fundamental principle.
That's incredible. But how do we get from a simple experiment to, powering entire cities? There's got to be more to it than just waving a wire around.
Well, it all started with a spark, literally. Back in 1882, New York City got its first central power station on Pearl Street. Imagine, gas lights flickering out, plunging the city into darkness. And then suddenly electric lights blaze on.
Must have blown everyone's minds.
I bet it did. A real turning point.
Talk about electrifying. But it was about more than just light bulbs, wasn't it? This whole electrification thing is like a major shift for society.
Absolutely. Electric streetcars replacing horse-drawn carriages, factories suddenly able to run all night, homes transformed by new appliances like electric irons and vacuum cleaners. Electrification changed everything.
Okay, so I know we hear these names all the time, Edison and Tesla, but what exactly did they do to make all this happen?
Well, Edison really nailed the incandescent light bulb, making electric lighting practical and affordable for everyone. That created huge demand for electricity. And then you have Tesla, who championed AC alternating current. AC turned out to be way more efficient for transmitting electricity over long distances, which made these giant power grids possible.
So was there innovations that really laid the groundwork for, the whole electrical system we have today? It's amazing. Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks here. How do we actually generate electricity? What are the main ways we make this stuff happen?
There are basically three main methods: generators, electrochemistry, and the photovoltaic effect.
All right, so generators. I think most people have at least a vague idea what those are, like those big spinning things that make electricity. But what makes them spin in the first place?
You're right. Almost all the electricity we use comes from generators. And to make them spin, you need motion. That motion can come from wind, moving water, or steam produced by burning fossil fuels or nuclear reactions.
Oh, so it's about converting all these different types of energy into motion, basically. And that motion makes the generator spin, and voila, we get electricity. What about this electrochemistry thing? That sounds a little more complicated.
It might sound fancy, but you actually interact with electrochemistry all the time. Batteries. They convert chemical energy directly into electricity. Think of all those devices we rely on. Our phones and laptops, they all run on batteries.
Wow, true. I guess I never thought of batteries as little electricity generators, but that's exactly what they are. Okay, and then we've got the photovoltaic effect, which is all about harnessing the sun's power, right?
Right on. Solar cells, also called photovoltaic cells, they convert sunlight directly into electricity. It's pretty amazing stuff and a really clean way to generate power.
So it's like free energy from the sun. Sounds like the perfect solution. But I've always heard that solar panels are ridiculously expensive. Is that still the case?
Solar panels do have a higher upfront cost, but the technology is getting better all the time, and the prices are actually going down. Solar energy is actually starting to become a real competitor to traditional power sources, and it's growing fast.
That's great news. Okay, so we've got the basic methods down, but let's zoom out a bit here. On a global scale, who's making all this electricity? And just how much are we talking about here?
Okay, so get this. In 2021, the world produced a whopping 28 petawatt hours of electricity. That's enough to power like 2 billion homes for a whole year.
28 petawatt hours. Whoa, I mean, that's a lot of juice. Who's leading the charge in all this?
This might surprise you, but China is actually the world's biggest electricity producer. They generate a third of the planet's total electricity.
A third. Really? How do they make so much?
A lot of it comes down to their reliance on coal. China has huge coal reserves, and they've invested heavily in coal-fired power plants. But, the U.S. actually produces about half as much electricity as China, but we use more natural gas and nuclear power. It's interesting how different countries have different energy mixes.
Right. Every country has its own approach. So earlier you mentioned turbines being important in electricity generation. Can you explain exactly what turbines are and what they do?
Think of turbines as like giant fans. They're the heart of power plants. They take all those different forms of energy, steam, gas, water, and convert them into the rotating force that actually powers the generators.
So depending on the source of power, different types of turbines are used.
Yep. There are steam turbines powered by heat from things like burning fossil fuels or nuclear reactions. And you've got gas turbines, which run directly on natural gas. And then water turbines, which are used in hydroelectric dams to harness the power of moving water.
So no matter the source, it's all about making those turbines spin.
Speaking of different energy sources, we've got to address the environmental impact of all this electricity generation.
You're absolutely right. It's the big issue, especially when we're talking about fossil fuels. Generating electricity, particularly from things like coal, has a big environmental cost.
Yeah, I mean, all those emissions from burning fossil fuels has got to be a major concern, right?
It is a big one. Take coal-fired power plants, for example. They're the biggest source of carbon dioxide emissions, releasing a massive amount of CO2 into the atmosphere each year, and all that CO2 contributes to climate change.
And on top of that, there's all the environmental damage caused by actually getting the coal out of the ground, too.
That's right. Coal mining can cause deforestation, destroy habitats, and pollute water sources. It can be really dangerous for the miners themselves. It's a complex issue with consequences that reach far beyond just generating electricity.
It's a lot to think about. Okay, so what about natural gas? We often hear it described as a cleaner alternative to coal. Is that actually true? Compared to coal, natural gas does have some advantages when it comes to emissions. It burns cleaner, so it releases less carbon dioxide for the same amount of energy produced.
So, a step in the right direction, but not a perfect solution.
Yeah. We have to look at the whole picture, not just the burning part. Extracting and transporting natural gas can actually release methane, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide.
So there are always trade-offs to consider. Every energy source comes with its own set of challenges. So now let's talk about nuclear power. It seems like a controversial one. Some people think it's a good solution to our energy needs, and others point to the risks. What's your take on nuclear power's role in all of this?
Nuclear power is a tricky one. It's definitely complicated. On the one hand, you have this big advantage. Nuclear plants don't emit greenhouse gases during operation. They use nuclear fission to create heat, which powers turbines, so it's clean in that way.
Sounds promising in terms of emissions, but then there's the safety issue and the whole question of what to do with the waste.
That's the catch, right? The possibility of accidents, like Chernobyl and Fukushima, is a serious concern. Those accidents were devastating, with long-term consequences for the environment and people's health. And then there's a radioactive waste. Figuring out how to store that stuff safely for thousands of years is a huge challenge.
So it's a tough call. Clean energy on the one hand, but serious risks on the other.
Exactly. Weighing the benefits against the risks is tough. And honestly, the debate about nuclear power probably isn't going away anytime soon.
So there are no easy answers when it comes to electricity generation. Every method has its pros and cons. We have to consider the environmental impacts, of course, but also the economic realities.
Totally. It's all connected. And it's becoming even more crucial to understand these complexities as the demand for energy keeps growing and we're trying to deal with climate change.
It's a lot to unpack. So far, we've looked at the history of electricity generation, the different ways it's made around the world, and the environmental challenges we face. It's been pretty eye-opening, I have to say.
We're just getting started. There's still a lot to explore. New technologies, the rise of renewable energy, and how all of this is changing the energy landscape. It's an exciting time to be talking about electricity generation, for sure.
You know, this whole idea of distributed generation, it's pretty fascinating to me. Like, what if everyone could make their own power? Like, wouldn't that be cool? And speaking of that, those massive solar farms we see popping up all over the place, those seem to fit into that distributed model, don't they?
They do. In the Wikipedia article, they actually refer to those as Photovoltaic power stations. Basically, they're just giant solar farms that are meant to feed electricity directly into the grid. And yeah, they're definitely becoming a bigger part of our energy mix.
It's crazy how far solar technology has come, right? I mean, we've gone from these little rooftop panels to these huge solar farms that can power entire cities.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. Some of these solar parks are absolutely enormous. Like, some of them have a capacity of over a gigawatt. That's enough to power hundreds of thousands of homes.
A gigawatt, wow. It's clear that solar is a major player in the energy game now. And of course, we can't forget about wind power. Those huge wind farms with all those giant turbines, they become such a common sight. What's the deal with those?
Wind farms are a great example of distributed generation in action. They use the kinetic energy of the wind to create electricity, and they're getting more and more cost effective, which is great. Plus, they're a clean alternative to fossil fuels.
I'm always amazed by the sheer size of some of these wind farms. Like, how big can they actually get?
Oh, they can be massive. Some of the biggest ones are in China, India, and the U.S. For example, there's this one in China, the Gansu wind farm. It's like this sprawling giant thing, and they're aiming for a capacity of 20,000 megawatts. That's enough to power a whole country.
20,000 megawatts. Whoa, that just boggles my mind. What about those offshore wind farms, the ones we see out in the ocean? Are those becoming more common too?
Totally. Offshore wind is a big deal. It makes sense because the wind out at sea is so strong and consistent. There's this one in the UK, the Hornsea Wind Farm. It's the biggest offshore wind farm in the world right now, and it has a capacity of over 1,200 megawatts.
It seems like both onshore and offshore wind power are really taking off. But I know there's been some concern about wind farms and their impact on wildlife, especially birds.
Yeah, that's a valid point. Even though wind farms don't produce emissions when they're operating, they can pose a risk to birds and bats. So choosing the right location for wind farms is really important to minimize those risks. There's a lot of research being done to figure out the best ways to protect wildlife and still harness wind energy effectively.
Good to know they're working on those issues. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the more traditional sources of electricity, starting with coal. It's been the go-to for electricity generation for a long time, but it comes with a pretty big environmental cost.
That's right. Coal-fired power plants are essentially giant steam engines. They burn coal to heat water, which creates steam to spin turbines. It's a pretty basic process, but it unfortunately creates a lot of pollution.
Yeah, I imagine all that smoke coming out of those plants must be a big concern.
It definitely is. Those plants release billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year, and carbon dioxide is a major greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change. So yeah, it's a problem.
And then, of course, there's all the environmental damage caused by mining the coal in the first place.
You're telling me. Coal mining can lead to deforestation, destroy habitats, and pollute water sources. Plus, it's super dangerous for the miners. It's a whole other set of issues to consider.
Sounds like coal has a lot of baggage. What about natural gas? We hear it talked about as a cleaner alternative to coal. Is that a fair assessment?
When it comes to emissions, natural gas does have an edge over coal. It burns cleaner, so it releases about half as much carbon dioxide for the same amount of energy.
Okay, so it's better than coal in that sense, but still not perfect.
Exactly. The burning part is only part of the story. The process of getting natural gas out of the ground and transporting it can actually release methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So it's not as simple as it might seem.
I guess there are always trade-offs no matter what energy source we're talking about. So let's talk about nuclear power. It seems like that's a topic that always sparks debate. Some see it as a good solution to our energy needs, and others are really worried about the risks. What are your thoughts on nuclear power's role in all of this?
Nuclear power is a tough one. There are definitely strong opinions on both sides. On the one hand, nuclear plants don't produce those greenhouse gas emissions during operation. They use nuclear fission to generate heat, which is then used to power turbines. So in that sense, it's a clean energy source.
Okay, so from a climate change perspective, it sounds good. But then there's the whole safety issue and the problem of what to do with all the radioactive waste.
Yeah, those are the big concerns for sure. We've seen what can happen when things go wrong, like in Chernobyl and Fukushima. Those accidents were really bad, and the consequences for people and the environment are still being felt today. And the radioactive waste, well, it's dangerous stuff, and we need to figure out how to store it safely for thousands of years. Yeah. That's a huge challenge.
So it's a real dilemma. We have the potential for clean energy, but with the risk of major accidents and this huge problem of waste disposal.
It's a tough one. You have to weigh the benefits against the risks, and there's no easy answer. I think the debate about nuclear power is going to continue for a long time.
It just goes to show that there's no magic bullet when it comes to electricity generation. Everything has its upsides and downsides. It's not just about the environmental impact, but also the economics of it all.
Exactly. It's a complex issue. And as we try to move towards a more sustainable future and keep up with the growing demand for energy, it's more important than ever to really understand these complexities.
You know, it's kind of hard to wrap my head around the sheer scale of all this. We've been talking about gigawatts and petawatt hours, but honestly, those numbers are just so big they lose all meaning. Like, how can we even imagine how much electricity a whole country can produce?
It's definitely a lot to grasp. When we talk about a country's electricity generation capacity, we're talking about how much power they can generate at any given moment. And the unit we use for that is the gigawatt, or GW for short.
Okay, so gigawatts are the unit of measurement. But can you give me an idea of what a gigawatt actually looks like in the real world?
Think of a typical nuclear power plant, one of those massive facilities you see in documentaries. One of those usually has a capacity of around 1 GW, and that one plant can power a city of about 1 million people.
Wow, so that's a lot of power. And when we're talking about countries with hundreds or even thousands of gigawatts of capacity, that's just mind-blowing. So who's got the most electricity generation capacity?
Well, unsurprisingly, China's at the top of the list. According to Wikipedia, as of 2022, they had a whopping 20,510 GW of total capacity.
2,510 gigawatts. That's like almost 3 times the capacity of the US, which comes in second with 1,330 GW. China really is an energy giant.
For sure. But just looking at total capacity doesn't tell the whole story. It's also important to consider per capita capacity. That basically tells us how much electricity is available for each person in a country.
Per capita, yeah, that makes sense. So which countries are leading the way when it comes to per capita capacity?
Iceland actually takes the top spot with an incredible 8,990 watts per capita. That's almost 9 times higher than the global average, which is around 1,120 watts per person.
Iceland. That's interesting. What's their secret?
Iceland's got a pretty unique situation. They've managed to tap into their geothermal and hydroelectric resources really effectively. So they've got a very clean and efficient energy system. It's a great example of what can be achieved when a country focuses on renewables.
It sounds like they're really ahead of the game. What about other countries with high per capita capacity?
Norway, which has tons of hydroelectric power, comes in second after Iceland with 7,530 watts per capita. And then there's Canada, which also relies heavily on hydropower with 4,460 watts per capita.
So access to renewable energy sources seems to be a key factor in those high per capita numbers. Are there any other interesting takeaways from all these comparisons?
Well, one thing that stands out is that all developed countries have per capita capacities that are above the global average. But even among developed countries, there's a lot of variation.
Oh, really? Like what?
Take the UK, for example. They actually have the lowest per capita capacity among developed countries at only 1,640 watts per person.
That's surprising. I wonder why that is.
It's probably a combination of factors, things like energy efficiency measures, how much economic activity is going on, and the mix of energy sources they use.
It seems like there's so much to consider when it comes to electricity generation, from the technology to the environmental impacts and the economic factors, too. It's a
Sure.
pretty complex issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as we're grappling with climate change and this ever-increasing demand for energy, understanding all these complexities is more important than ever.
Well said. This deep dive has been so insightful. We've gone from Faraday's early discoveries to these massive solar farms and talked about the challenges of finding sustainable solutions. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And who knows what the future holds? Maybe someday we'll even be able to harness the power of fusion. The same process that powers the stars. Now, that would be truly revolutionary.
That's an incredible thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of electricity generation. We've learned so much about the amazing processes that power our world, and it looks like there are some really exciting possibilities on the horizon.